Speaking of national masters being a much higher caliber in those days, Géza Füster was only, quote-unquote, a national master. He would become an international master later, but at the time this was played, Füster was but a national master, playing for Canada, but he was born in Budapest, Hungary, February 1910. He passed away in 1990. It was not until 1969 that Füster would become an international master, even though he was Hungarian chess champion in 1941. And he won quite a few Budapest championships, the first of which was in 1936. He was also the Hungarian correspondence chess champion in 43 and 44. But in 1953, he immigrated to Canada, and in 1955, he was the Canadian speed champion. He also won the United States Speed Chess Championship in 1957, which apparently was open to foreigners. Well, he's playing in this tournament not by direct qualification. The Canadian Chess Championship did double as a zonal tournament, but Füster did not win it. He came in second place. But the tournament winner, Paul Vytonis, was unable to go due to lack of funding. The prize for this event, first through 12th prizes, were 300,000 denarii. 300,000 denarii, 225,000 for second, 200,000 for third, 120,000 for fourth, 100,000 for fifth, 80,000 for sixth, 60,000 for seventh, 50,000 for eighth, 45,000 for ninth, 40,000 for 10th. I skipped one somehow. Anyway, down to 30,000 by increments. And anybody under 12th place, remember there are 21 players, anyone under 12th place was paid 2,000 denarii per point that they scored. So if they didn't score any points, which everybody scored at least 1 point. The last place finisher was Füster, who scored 2 points, 1 win and 2 draws. Poor guy. But that gave him only 4,000 denarii. Well, how much is 4,000 denarii in dollars? It wasn't a whole lot. I think the tournament winner, if you converted it to modern day values, was something like $18,000, which actually isn't bad, but by today's standards, it's nothing. My only point is the guy who should have been there couldn't go because he could not afford the trip. He didn't have funding to go. Géza Füster didn't actually earn his place in the Interzonal. Paul Vytonis was the qualified player, and because he reneged, as runner-up, Füster was appointed. He came in the last place, unfortunately. 1 win and 2 draws from Füster. But that is not to diminish, again, he was national champion in Hungary in 1941. If you're national champion in any country, you're a strong player. All right, so we have d4 from Füster. Knight f6, c4, no surprise to see the King's Indian defense with g6. Knight c3, bishop g7, the normal variation. e4, pawn d6, pawn f3. Now, this f3 is the anti-Grunfeld variation, and e5 is Friedrich Samisch's variation. Again, in case you don't remember, and we've seen this variation several times on this show, so you probably do remember, but I'll mention it anyway because Samisch is not as well known as some of the other people for whom openings are named. He lived from 1896 to 1975. He was from Germany, and he was among the first recipients of the official Grandmaster title when it was standardized in 1950. So knight ge2 and kingside castles brings us to the Bobotsov-Korchnoi-Petrosian variation. And I hardly have to introduce you to Viktor Korchnoi or world champion Tigran Petrosian. But again, I'll mention Milko Bobotsov, who was the first Bulgarian to attain the Grandmaster title. And that was in 1961, by the way. Bobotsov was the Bulgarian champion in 1958, the year this took place. Anyway, coming back, bishop e3, the orthodox variation. c6, queen d2, queen's knight to d7, pawn d5, pawn takes the pawn. And here, knight takes the pawn was played. The book move is, in fact, c takes d5, which opens this diagonal. It also opens this file. So it is certainly preferable, and in the book for good reason. C takes d5 is usually answered by a6, g4, and pawn h5. Here, Füster played knight takes the pawn. Now knight takes the knight and queen takes the knight. Same comment as before. Pawn takes is going to be preferred because it opens the diagonal and the file. But queen takes the pawn was played by Füster, and Bobby plays knight c5 here. I thought knight to b6 would be more active, hitting the queen and also hitting that pawn. But knight c5 from Bobby. By the way, on knight b6, that will push the queen to d3, won't it? Because he'll want to maintain contact. Well, I'm okay. I got a thumbs up. And then you can play something like f5 here. All right, anyway, knight c5 here from Bobby Fischer. And queenside castles, queen a5, queen takes the pawn. That undefends this knight. Well, it underdefends the knight, so he retreats to e6. Now pawn a3, preparing pawn b4. Bobby played b5 here. Rook d8 would be definitely more compelling, hitting the queen. And after, say, queen b4, and rook takes rook, check, king takes rook, queen takes queen, pawn takes queen. With this diagonal obstructed, you might play bishop f8 here and hit that pawn. Coming back, b5 was the move here. Bishop d2 hits the queen, and queen a4. Queen b4. Now don't get crazy and say, oh, let me attack the queen. After queen b3, now you're compelled for queen b4, and after queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, and pawn takes the pawn. He can pick up this pawn, but these are very weak. I'm coming over with rook b8, and this king is not well defended. His safety is definitely compromised in this line. Coming back, so queen b4 is the move chosen by Füster, and Bobby with rook b8, aiming at the queen. Okay, bishop a6 was worth a try. Maybe queen a6 would have been okay. Queen a6 here. Doesn't like queen a6. Didn't like rook b8 either. Queen takes the queen, pawn takes the queen. Bishop b4 obstructs this, hits that. Rook d8. The rooks are traded. Rook takes rook, knight takes rook, and now knight c3. Bishop d7 here, bishop d6, rook a8. Rook c8 is preferred by the bot, though, here, aiming at the king. c5 gets a question mark. I thought knight d5 was best, but now that I see the arrow, okay, I get a star for knight d5. But now that I see this arrow here from the bot, I realize that's also really strong because obviously it makes way for the rook to come to d1. Knight b7 could be played. This is on the bishop e2 line, and then the rook to d1. Okay. Instead, c5 was played. Knight b7 was played anyway. Bishop b5, putting the question to this bishop, and so the bishops are traded on b5. Bishop takes bishop, knight takes the bishop. And this pawn is starting to look a little ominous. A passed pawn, and you know passed pawns are meant to be pushed. Well, after knight takes the bishop, that would allow the pawn to make even further progress. The problem with that would be an open c-file against the king. So instead, Bobby just takes the pawn, and that's a great move because, speaking of the open c-file, bishop takes knight, and we can pin the bishop to the king, which is what Fischer played. So you pick up a pawn in the process. Knight takes the A7 pawn. The bot indicating king B1, I thought maybe you could play knight C3 and put some heat on this more advanced A pawn. Of course, rook takes the bishop either way, and the knight can't take the pawn right away because he'd become pinned. But knight takes the A7 pawn from Füster, and rook takes the bishop check. Now, I thought bishop H6 check first would be preferable because it's coming with tempo in that it's check, and then you can grab the bishop on the subsequent turn. And the benefit of bishop to H6 is that it vacates the G7 square for the king to get active in the endgame. Bobby going right ahead with rook takes bishop check, king b1. And of course that makes way for his rook to challenge the other rook on the c file. So for that reason, now bishop h6 was played. And I think these moves were kind of flip-flopped by Fischer. But that does prevent the rook from coming over, doesn't it? So instead, Füster played the rook to d1, which makes a lot of sense, even though it gets a big question mark. It's a pretty natural move to get the rook on the open file. The bot calling for rook e1. Not sure exactly why rook e1 would be better. Your only move from there would be able to be rook e2. I gather rook e1 is to keep the bishop from coming to e3. Well, rook d1 was played, king g7, and again, this makes perfect sense to me, evading the check that is looming and getting the king active. g4 was played by Füster, which is a mistake. That's going to lose a pawn after bishop f4. Rook e1 again being called for. Yeah, definitely rook e1 is for the purpose of preventing bishop to e3, which is what Bobby ends up playing. But I kind of like bishop f4. And for a change, the bot agrees with me. Here h4 was played, and the bot calls for b4. And the point is, it lures this pawn to take en passant, making this pawn a passed pawn. King b2, check, take, takes, but you do have an outside passed pawn. Pawn h4 from Füster. Bobby with pawn h5. The bot calling for bishop d4. I would like to hit this pawn. I get a star for that. Pawn h5 from Fischer. Pawn takes the pawn. And now the blunder. Get ready, ladles and jelly spoons. In fact, this is such a bad blunder, we need to bring out you-know-who. This guy right here calls Captain Blunderpants to the screen. Why? Well, it loses the knight. Notice this piece relationship here. And so you can play the discovered attack, which Bobby plays, rook c1 check. So for that reason, king a2 is definitely safer. Or, again, b4 with the same idea as b4. Luring the A-man to b3 so that king b2 can be played, and same comment as b4 when I said b4. Yeah, rook d3. Now, I gather they were in really bad time trouble, or at least Füster was, to play such a blunder as this, because this piece relationship is very obvious, and this check is very obvious. The check was played, the king comes to a2 by force, and the bishop picks up the knight, and suddenly black is winning this easily. In fact, after rook d7, bishop d4, pawn f4, rook c2, super attacking the b-man, king a1, and rook d2. Well, here, Füster resigned. And the point is that a discovered attack is being threatened here as well, which means that you'd have to play king b1, because any other move, and bishop takes the pawn. Well, I guess you could play rook b7, but now I've got a passed pawn here that's going to come up. But the arrow did call for king b1, where we could play rook takes pawn check, king c1, rook e2. And after pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, right? It's all over here. So pretty well fought game until that move right there. In fact, Füster's accuracy was 84.7, Bobby's 91.2, and the individual single game ratings were 2,400 for white and 2,700 for black.